Good evening, everyone. My name is Matthew Gillikin. I'm the co-chair of Livable Cville. We're an all-volunteer group here in Charlottesville that advocates for policies to build an inclusive Charlottesville area with affordable housing, sustainable transportation, and healthy neighborhoods welcoming to all. And we're very excited to have James Freas with us today as we learn more about what's going on with the Cville Plans process. Just a quick overview of how that has played out. In March of 2021, the City Council approved affordable housing plan, and then in November approved the comprehensive plan. And now we've moved into the zoning rewrite, which is a lengthy, fairly technical process. The city has released a couple reports this summer about kind of the plan for the zoning rewrite, and that's what James is going to be talking about with us today. So just a little bit about James. So just so everyone knows for future reference, his last name is pronounced Freas, rhymes with lease, and he earned a bachelor's degree in psychology from UVA and as a master's of community planning from University of Rhode Island and a master's of studies in environmental law from the Vermont Law School. Prior to joining the city of Charlottesville in September 2021 as the Director of Neighborhood Development Services, he served as the Director of the Department of Community and Economic Development in the town of Natwick, Massachusetts. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce Natwick. He also worked in Newton, Massachusetts and Hampton, Virginia. So I'm gonna hand it over to you, James. Thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely, Matthew, thank you for having me. It's actually Natick, Massachusetts. Natick. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen if I can remember again how to do that. Just take me 1 second. All right, Matthew, is that up and showing?
That is great.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. Well, as you had already covered, kind of where we've been, Cville Plans Together, a community process for updating the future vision for the city with a focus on equity and affordability. Began with the Affordable Housing Plan, as you noted, and the comprehensive plan adopted back in November of 2021. And now we are in this zoning ordinance rewrite process. So I'm going to walk through a little bit, provide a little bit of background on what is zoning, talk about the relationship between zoning and our comprehensive plan, talk about the report, really two-part report that was released this past summer, and our next steps going forward. So I'd like to start with a little bit on what is zoning, just to kind of level the playing field for everybody in the room. So we're all kind of operating under the same understanding of what it is that we're here to talk about tonight. So zoning, most basically, is a set of regulations that govern the use and development of land. So that's what essentially can be built on a piece of property and how that property can be used, what kind of businesses or other uses a property owner can make of their property. And it consists of a set of elements, most primarily the zoning map and the zoning ordinance. So the zoning map divides the city up into districts, and then there's a set of rules for each one of those districts. Those rules are embodied within the zoning ordinance itself and cover, again, each of those districts and what uses are allowed in those districts or what standards might apply in those districts. A set of development standards that apply broadly that cover such issues as lighting, landscaping, signage, etc. So basically the rules of development. And then finally, there's an administration section, which basically talks about how the ordinance, how the city kind of governs this ordinance, how decisions are made, where there might be a discretionary decision, say with a special use permit or a variance, or how changes to the zoning ordinance itself are made. So that's a picture of zoning at a very, very, very basic level. So next, going into our comprehensive plan and zoning together. So zoning is one of our primary tools for implementing the comprehensive plan. So while the comprehensive plan essentially lays out our policies and goals for the city and presents a long-term vision. The zoning ordinance itself, as we've discussed, is a body of actual rules that then are serve to advance those goals and objectives. When we talk about rewriting the zoning ordinance, what we're talking about is looking at all pieces of the zoning ordinance. So every single section, every piece, every clause is being analyzed for its consistency with the adopted comprehensive plan. And when I refer to the comprehensive plan, I really am using that as an umbrella term for the affordable housing plan as well, and also including the small area plans that the city has adopted over the last number of years. So we're looking at what do we need to change within our zoning ordinance in order to support implementation of all of those plans. We're also looking at mitigating, as it says here, or eliminating really the flaws and barriers in that plan that have been identified either by staff or really anyone else who works with the zoning ordinance, who's recognized that there are provisions within our zoning ordinance that conflict with each other, for example, or that conflict with state law. We need to, those are things that we clearly need to remedy. And then finally, one of our goals with this zoning ordinance rewrite is to make the whole document easier to read and apply. That's both for our residents to be able to understand what the zoning ordinance says very clearly, but also makes it easier for staff to enforce the zoning ordinance when there aren't conflicts over the basic interpretation of the document itself. As it notes here, some sections of this zoning ordinance are going to be completely rewritten from scratch. They may be brand new districts or ideas, whereas other sections may adapt or even utilize existing text. But again, every single section of the ordinance is going to be looked at. I also want to note here that as we go through this process and we really dig into the details of applying zoning and creating zoning districts for the city, that could lead to changes to the comprehensive plan, including the land use map. And those would be brought forward as part of the adoption process at the end of the zoning rewrite project. So when I say that our charge is to implement the comprehensive plan, it makes sense then to kind of take a look. What does the comprehensive plan say? And the land use vision itself is a good starting point in that. It speaks to increasing the supply and affordability of housing, addressing inequities in the distribution of land uses and the impacts of development, and then addressing issues like walkability, protecting the natural environment, and scaling new development to a scale that's we use the term familiar to or consistent with our city's existing neighborhoods. And we speak, and we're looking also at the urban design of the community and historic preservation, and ensuring that as change happens, as new development occurs, that we're continuing to support the historical identity of the city and its existing culture. Now, we'll note again throughout this discussion of the vision of the comprehensive plan, it does keep referring back to the issue of housing. And it's important to kind of understand why. If we look back at the affordable housing plan, there's a lot of data that's looking at what is the state of housing in the city of Charlottesville. I just pulled out one data piece that is demonstrating that the household income required to afford the median home price, and this was as of 2018. We know it's in fact gone up since then, but the household income necessary to afford the median home was $77,949. But the actual median household income was $58,933. So we see a mismatch there, right? And the trend line is such that housing costs, the cost to purchase a home, rental rates, those are going up. And as a result, we're seeing a change in the community as well. The number of households in the city that are higher income, wealthier households are increasing, while the number of lower income households are decreasing. Now, this is an issue that predates this effort. It's not like this is a new issue that we recently discovered. This is an issue that the city has been discussing and debating on how to resolve for a very long time. But with this effort, with this affordable housing plan, with the comprehensive plan, we're looking to take concrete actions to address these issues and these trend lines. And so the Affordable Housing Plan has three major initiatives, which I encourage folks, if you have not reviewed the Affordable Housing Plan, to take a look at it. It goes into a lot more detail than this, but the three major aspects of that plan are the dedication of additional dollars, $10 million annually to affordable housing. I should say that's a total of $10 million. Building inclusive governance at all levels. And what that's really getting at is how are we allocating that funding, and are we inclusive in who is involved in the decision-making of how that money is allocated. And then finally, adopting progressive and inclusionary zoning reforms. And that brings us back to the zoning rewrite. But before we go there, I wanted to touch on the remainder of the ideas presented in the land use chapter of the comprehensive plan. If one looks there, you see there's a lot of strategies that speaks very, very clearly towards what we need to be accomplishing within the zoning ordinance. Because as the vision statement I described earlier alludes to, it's not just about producing affordable housing, producing more housing. Those are very much key tenets of this entire effort, but we also need to be looking at walkability. We need to be looking at how we can use our land use policies and zoning to address the effects of climate change, job creation, economic development, historic preservation. So there's a lot that we're hoping and aiming to accomplish within the zoning ordinance rewrite. It's a big task and a lot of decisions that need to be made as we go forward through this process. So now I'm going to go ahead and dive into the zoning diagnostic and approach report. We did do a very similar presentation to this Monday night with the steering committee, and I encourage folks to watch the recording of that, which I believe was posted late yesterday or early today. That recording, you'll see our consultant team went into much greater detail than frankly I'm able to get into in what's in this report. So I encourage folks to take a look at that presentation. And for that matter, take a look online at this report and the portion of it that dives into the inclusionary zoning issue, which I'll get to in a moment, has a narrated version, which is also very helpful. And we've had a lot of people watching that video as well. So the intent of this report, the zoning diagnostic and approach report, is, as it says here, identify the issues with the current zoning ordinance. Really what I see this as is our conceptual plan for the zoning ordinance, broadly laying out here are the proposed types of policies and regulations that we would include within the zoning ordinance in order to meet the goals and objectives of the comprehensive plan and the affordable housing plan. What I want to highlight here, we don't have draft zoning text at this point. We don't have a draft zoning map. We right now, what we're looking for is feedback on this set of ideas at this conceptual level so that we can move forward into the drafting phase. Not only is this a very detailed report on a lot of different ideas for regulations and policies, but at the back of the report, you'll find a table that really goes through the comprehensive plan and the zoning ordinance in detail to identify those places where there's mismatches or opportunities. So an outline of the diagnostic approach report. You can see the three main sections that I'm going to talk about tonight are those dealing with affordable housing, the testing work that our consultant team did, and then finally a section talking about all of those different policies and proposed policies and regulations. So coming directly from the affordable housing plan, there's four major tenets towards addressing the need for more housing supply and more affordable housing. First, we have the idea of allowing more units on every lot. That's currently zoned for a single residential unit, allowing more rental and ownership options, and then creating zoning incentives through what we refer to as an inclusionary zoning policy. And I'll dig in a little deeper into what that means. And then creating a toolkit or a set of policies, regulations, or approaches to reduce or eliminate the risk of displacement for certain communities. So one of the most important things, one of the most important aspects of the zoning, one of the most important aspects of our comprehensive plan is the proposal for the general residential area and the medium intensity areas. So first off, what we're aiming for in these areas, these are areas that are currently, for the most part, zoned for single family residential. And what we're aiming for is to create a program or a body of regulations that allows for new house scaled development to occur in these places. That's basically speaking to an idea of smaller scale multifamily development. And I use the words incremental change because as is talked about in the inclusionary zoning report, and I'll touch on again, this change is going to occur over time. Just the very nature of the housing market and the way development works suggests that that it's going to take it is going to be a significant amount of time for new housing development to occur. The other thing I want to touch on here is the goal is, as I've said, to create these smaller multifamily units that basically to fill in that space between what we, for the most part, allow today, which is single family development or large scale multifamily. There's a space in between there, and in that space for these smaller scale, house scale, medium, what's sometimes referred to as missing middle housing types, there's a significant degree of benefits that we have for encouraging those types of housing. First off is a greater choice in homes within our existing neighborhoods. For many people, the opportunity to, say, downsize into a different type of housing units without having to necessarily leave their neighborhood, leave where they've lived for some number of years, is an option that we want to be able to create for people, or see people to be able to have that choice within the housing types that they can live in. It also creates an opportunity for job creation, as I will talk about in a little bit. One of the great opportunities here is that, on the one hand, we haven't been producing these types of middle intensity, missing middle housing types, and so there aren't a whole lot of people doing this work. As these become part of the housing environment in the city, there is now an opportunity for people to take on the job of doing those and kind of fill a niche that's not currently being filled. So there's a job creation opportunity for local builders to move into small scale development. And then finally, and very significantly, there's an opportunity for what we could refer to as natural affordability. These aren't going to be, for the most part, deed restricted affordable units, but they are going to be more affordable than a lot of the existing housing stock in many parts of the city. And in there is an opportunity to create options and opportunities for people. So inclusionary zoning is a significant part of this project. And this slide describes the principles that we've used in putting together this program. Overall, we're aiming for a program that is realistic for our local real estate market, which is to say that it doesn't attempt to extract more affordable housing than a project can necessarily support. But we are aiming to increase or improve the level of affordability that we do get out of these projects. And another really important point is that we want these units that are created through this program to be affordable for as long as possible. So the report that we released now, I think we're approaching 3 weeks ago, details the inclusionary zoning program. And basically this slide sums that up. We're aiming for a requirement that the units that are produced be at 60% of area median income. That once a project is at 10 or more residential units, 10% of those units must be affordable at that 60% of AMI. At nine or fewer units, it would be voluntary. The term of affordability, that is how long these units are required to remain at that 60% of AMI affordable level, is, we set it at 99 years, but what that effectively means is in perpetuity, or for as long as the building exists. And then this is another really important point, that the affordable units have to be of equal size and generally of similar character as the market rate units, and they have to be evenly distributed throughout the project. So you can't cluster the affordable units in one part, one section of the building, and you can't make them all smaller units. They have to be of equal size and distribution. We're proposing this policy to apply across really wherever residential development is permitted within the city. It says here, in the general residential medium and higher intensities, you should include within there the mixed use districts as well. So basically anywhere where residential is permitted, this policy applies. And then in order to make this program consistent with state law and feasible, we've included an incentive program at 10, for those projects that are 10 plus units, there's a 25% density bonus. At the 9 or less, there's a 2-unit bonus in the general residential and a 4-unit bonus in the medium intensity. And then a parking reduction of up to 50%. What's important to note is whether or not a project can achieve the density bonus that's provided for here, or any of these provisions that are provided for here on the incentive side, the affordability requirement in the left-hand box still applies. So it's not it's not that you only have to provide those if you make use of the density bonus. It is, you have to provide those, and if you can make use of the density bonus. Now, what I'm seeing is that I did skip a slide, so I'm in putting together this presentation, so I apologize for that, but I'm just going to talk briefly about the rate of change analysis that's in the inclusionary zoning report that we released a few weeks ago. The intent behind that piece of analysis was really to try and predict how is the housing market going to react to this proposed zoning, and what, as the title implies, what is the rate of change we might expect to see. It's well worth studying that. What we found is that looking at just the financial feasibility, the broad brush physical characteristics of the lots within the city, and the rate of lot turnover, that is the rate of lot sale within the city, we're predicting roughly 400 units a year over a 3-year period. Now, what I want to emphasize is that that is an upper maximum based on our analysis, because what we aren't able to take into account are the demand factors. So it's a supply side analysis. It's simply looking at how many units could be supplied. It's not looking at what the demand would necessarily be for those units. It doesn't account for the detailed physical characteristics of any given lot. So the particular slopes of a lot, existing tree cover that's required to be preserved, and depending on the context, and a range of other physical factors on the lot are not accounted for. And then the other thing that's not accounted for, which is really an important piece of this, is again coming back to that idea that there's going to be a learning curve for people within our development community, for builders, and also for homeowners that might choose to make an investment. They're going to have to learn how to produce this type of unit, and it's I think some people might say, well, how is that difficult? It's challenging to understand what are the financing mechanisms, what are the long-term, who am I selling these units to, or what does the rental situation look like? there's frankly a lot of challenging decisions that one has to make that people just don't have a history of doing. And so those questions around financing the project, say it's a 4-unit conversion, that means I have to provide 4 kitchens and 1 or 1.5 or 2 bathrooms, depending on the size of the units for each one. Those are the most expensive parts of the unit. Can I make those numbers pencil out? So there's a learning curve that we're going to be, that our development community is going to be going through before we really realistically are going to see a return, see these types of units produced. All that being said, on the benefit side of creating the opportunity for our supply to be increased and those other benefits that might come with that, make this a valuable component of the zoning work going forward.
James, can I just hop in and
Sure.
this expected rate of change is interesting, and I just want to
Yeah.
if I could explain my understanding, and you could tell me where I'm wrong, and maybe
Sure.
that'll help us. So what you're saying is that in the general residential and medium intensity areas,
Yep.
expectation is that about kind of on the upper end, somewhere around 400 units out of, I think, about 10,000
That's correct.
would turn over a year potentially.
And that's 400 units, not 400 lots, to be clear.
400 units. Okay. Helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then of those 400, a certain percentage, because of the topography and lot size and things like that, it's unlikely that they would undergo additional redevelopment to expand the number of units. A certain number, just because whoever bought it wants to keep it roughly as is. So there's kind of a couple reasons why people maybe just would turn over and basically say the same. And then kind of a small, who knows, maybe a quarter, maybe a half would actually be feasible candidates for some kind of redevelopment, either into the new by right amount they're allowed to build, or, well, I guess this would sort of, the by right without designated affordable units, or the by right with affordable units on top of that. So we're kind of expecting a few different possibilities that's going to lead to like essentially a fairly modest rate of change in the general residential and medium intensity areas.
Right. And that comes back to that comment about it being incremental over time, right? What we're doing is the objective here is really to set up a mechanism that allows for incremental change over time with the goal of stabilizing the housing market and creating more choice or options, if you will, within the housing market, again, over time. So that people at different stages of life, or who have different choices they want to make, right now, from a very large extent, our housing market is giving you a choice between single family or large scale multifamily. And it's leaving out whatever segment of our population might be interested in living in a 4-unit multifamily within a neighborhood, right? That might be a very ideal housing type for a young couple or for an older resident. That's kind of the space we want to work in, is how do we create those opportunities?
Great, thank you. That's helpful. I hope that clarified a little bit. I think your explanation was good. I just wanted to kind of explain it, or kind of go through, because I think it's a really important point, right, and kind of hopefully will help people feel a little more comfortable with what they might expect their neighborhood to look like over time with some of these changes, with the recognition that there will be change citywide. That's sort of what we're saying, but we're probably not really looking at quick or dramatic change.
And it's also, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, that's exactly the point. I mean, it's it's going to take time. I'm sorry, I had another thought and I lost it, but at some point it may come back to me, and maybe we'll come back to this as the discussion progresses. So another portion of the diagnostic and approach report was what we refer to as the residential district testing. Very similarly, this was our consultant team looking at what's kind of a maximum build out possible on lots that might be typical within the city of Charlottesville, and using those max build outs to try and test and understand what appropriate rules around setbacks and lot coverage and other issues might be as they go forward. So they did this analysis and arrived at a number of recommended changes to zoning based on exploring what could be done on these lots. So again, this is another really interesting section of the report to review and understand kind of what they found as they were exploring these rules. So then I want to dive into the better zoning standards. We divided these up into 5 different sections. These are the ones that are really getting at both best practices within zoning and meeting a lot of those other goals, from walkability to historic preservation. It's important to note our existing zoning ordinance was really written or is geared towards greenfield development. Our existing ordinance does not deal with redevelopment or infill development terribly well. Infill development, redevelopment are much more difficult than greenfield development. They create a whole range of additional complications, and when the regulations don't anticipate or recognize those complications, it just makes it that much harder to both for the city to regulate and for a builder to respond. And excuse me. And I've noted before, we're also, again, looking to support local small scale developers. How can we build that cohort of people from our community who can participate in these types of projects for obviously for their individual benefit, but also for the benefit of the community, because we're making use of our native talent. So for each one of these, I'm just going to use one example. The steering committee meeting from Monday night, the recording of that, our consultant team dove into a few more examples from each one of these sections. So this particular example is looking at how we measure height, and they're recommending that we use both a number of stories measurement as well as an absolute height maximum. And then the other recommendation that's worth highlighting is encouraging the development of more kinds on more kinds of lots. In this example, one really interesting type of development that has become more common really nationally, and we have one example, at least one that I'm aware of here in the city, is this idea of a set of individual cottages, or these could be small 2-family buildings around a shared community green. And in this example, the zoning would actually set up the ability to create individual sublots that would be saleable in their own right, which then simplifies the development process and allows us to encourage more of this type of development. Around uses, again, we have a number of recommendations here around what to do with our regulations of use. But one of them is to manage use or regulate use based on its impact. So the example here is actually a pretty common one, where a bakery might be, the use table under our zoning ordinance would potentially treat a neighborhood-oriented bakery, a small-scale retail bakery shop, the same as a wholesale baker or bakery. And obviously, those are two very, very different things. We would want to regulate them differently. We would want to allow them in different places. So we need a body of rules that actually allows us to do that.
James, actually, there was a question that someone asked along the lines of,
Sure.
of this, and I think this might be a good time
Mhm.
to ask it. So they're kind of asking for clarification on what I think they're asking is that in the current situation, there is a lot of what I think the term of the art is discretionary review around commercial uses potentially when a rezoning or a special use permit occurs. And the person is concerned that with the new zoning code, that we might find ourselves in a situation where businesses, because there won't be as much review, that certain types of businesses might show up that would be less preferable to a neighborhood or to individuals in the neighborhood. And I guess, I know that there's a vision of allowing like some small scale commercial and things like that in the comprehensive plan.
Mhm.
But I guess if you could just kind of comment on how we will have a system that kind of allows neighborhoods to have some degree of say in what goes into their neighborhood in terms of businesses, and how that relates to the desire to have an efficient zoning code that doesn't let things get bogged down in lots and lots of review and meetings and things like that.
Sure. So let me just touch real quick on this slide, because this is where I'm talking about that idea of an accessory commercial unit. It's both a new use that are showing up in a number of zoning ordinances over the last decade or so, but it's an old use, right? This is something that once was very common in city neighborhoods throughout the country. What is really being contemplated here is a very limited set of commercial uses that might be allowed in a small footprint accessory structure or portion of an existing building, and under a pretty strict set of rules. It's expanding on home occupations to a certain degree that we do currently allow, but expanding on that idea. And I think there's a lot more, as we get into the details of the zoning ordinance, we'll be working on this issue to define what are those uses that we might or might not allow, and what within this category, and what are those rules that would govern it. I wouldn't take this picture necessarily as an example of what we're looking for so much as an example of the concept generally. So let's talk about when we talk about that discretionary review process, we're talking about the special use permit. And historically, the city of Charlottesville has often used the special use permit to get to allow taller buildings in exchange for affordable units, affordable residential units. And what we are proposing is the new inclusionary zoning ordinance to mandate those inclusionary units, and therefore switching that over to a by right process. Now, the by right process makes that, as you noted, more efficient, more streamlined, which translates into a savings in the project that helps to make those affordable units financeable within the project. And also, it's a fact that a special use permit process discourages many projects from even getting off the ground. The larger projects, the big projects that we've seen, they generally can absorb the additional cost of a special use permit process, the time primarily, the additional soft costs in design work and lawyers' fees, etc. It's the smaller projects, again, the ones that we would like to encourage within the city, that are hard hit by those additional costs and often just can't pencil out when they have to factor in a somewhat unpredictable discretionary review process. Now, when it comes to commercial or business uses, I think there's still going to be a category of commercial and business uses that are subject to a special use permit. The intent of the special use permit is to recognize that there's uses that require an extra degree of scrutiny that is site specific, that recognizes that not every place is the same, and for those commercial or business uses, we would still require a special use permit process, that discretionary permit review through the Planning Commission and City Council. So that's something that's still very much on the table and will be fleshed out further as we move into the drafting of the zoning ordinance. Now, does that answer the range of questions, Matthew, that you're?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So then again, we have a number of site standard recommendations. One of those is encouraging the retention of existing structures. So one of the primary ways we're doing that is in the general residential district. It will allow up to 3 units by right, but you can get a 4th unit if you retain the existing structure. So right there, we're creating a strong incentive for the retention of existing structures. I'd also note in here, we're looking at rules that would help encourage alternative energy and both alternative energy and energy efficiency improvements. There's a few places where zoning really ends up in conflict with attempts to install alternative energy or address energy efficiency through, say, extra insulation or putting a foyer or a vestibule on the front of the house. These are things that can help you save energy, but can end up conflicting with zoning. And then the administration recommendations, we were just touching on this with regards to development by right and the use of the special use permit. But the other thing that's really important is updating our non-conforming use options. There are non-conforming use as a use that at some point in time was allowed in a given neighborhood. There may be a corner grocery store in a residential area that's been there since before zoning. So if it predates zoning, it was allowed at the time it was built, but it's no longer consistent with the zoning, so it's called non-conforming. Those uses are allowed to continue for as long as they continue to exist. We are proposing to improve the rules we have for regulating those uses, because there's certain rights that accrue with non-conforming uses, and our current ordinance is somewhat confusing on those points. And then this is something I mentioned earlier, the recommendations for making our zoning ordinance easier to use. I don't know how many people here today have tried to look at our existing zoning ordinance. It's not an easy read. The new zoning ordinance is going to use illustrations, layout. It's going to have tables, graphics like what are shown here. We're going to use a plain English drafting style, so moving away from legalese. It will be first and foremost a digital document with hyperlinks within it. So there's a lot of things that we're doing to make this an easier to use document. Again, that's to the benefit of our residents, who will be able to clearly understand what they can do with their property or what can happen on a property within their neighborhood. And it's also of a benefit to the city in improving our ability to enforce the zoning ordinance and not get into contentious battles over interpretation. So I'm going to wrap up here, just looking ahead. So we are wrapping up this first phase of the zoning ordinance rewrite project. It's a 3-part process. This first part is that report that we've released. This section of the project, this part of the project culminates on September 27th with a joint meeting of the Planning Commission and the City Council, where we're going to get their feedback and their response to what's been proposed. When we have that, we're going to be able to begin drafting the document and drafting the zoning map. We intend to have that draft document available in we're aiming for January, maybe early February of 2023. And then we will do another round of engagement opportunities as we've done over the past summer. And then we will go into, then we'll take all of that feedback, take all the comments and recommendations that we get, and we will turn that into a final draft of the zoning ordinance, which will go into the adoption process in spring of 2023. I say every time I say spring 2023, I feel like it's necessary to remind folks that spring goes to June 21st, and we're going to use every bit of that time, I suspect, to get to a final product to put in front of Planning Commission and City Council. So there's a lot of different ways to connect with us. The best are, of course, to send an email through the engage@cvilleplans.together.com email address. I read every single email that comes through that. I read every single one very carefully. And we're using that as a source as we are considering what changes we need to make to the current draft document and what we need to think about as we move forward into the next phase of drafting. There's also a survey available. The website is here as well. And of course, all of these reports, all of this information and links to everything can be found on our website, the Cville Plans Together.com website. And I should note, we're in a public comment period on the current document that's ending on September 6th, so directly after Labor Day. When I say that's ending, what I mean is the comments we receive up until that point are the ones that we're going to be considering for drafting the final version of this report that we'll present to Planning Commission and City Council at the end of the month. But that doesn't mean you can't continue to send us comments. I will certainly, I know for a fact, I will be reading comments and questions through the entire fall, through the entire drafting process, and we will consider additional comments equally. Really, that deadline is just to reflect what we can feasibly consider as we move into this final report.
And James, someone had asked, will this, the batch of comments leading up to September 6th be made publicly available?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Just as we've done in the past, we'll issue a memo or a report. I actually am not. We'll issue something that'll have a compilation of the comments that we've received to date. So yeah, absolutely.
Great. Do you have anything else to share? Are we ready for Q&A? Okay, you can.
I'm ready. Let me get out of this screen sharing.
So folks, we've got a number of questions. If you have any questions you want to add, go ahead and send them to me in the chat. One person asked if you would just kind of talk a little bit about what transitions in scale and use would look like as this kind of goes into action, I guess.
Absolutely. What that is referring to is a body of rules that are going to speak to the transitions between zoning districts. And those transit, it's going to vary across different districts as to what exactly those rules look like, what degree of transition is necessary. But in some cases, that could be height transitions that say when you're moving from a higher intensity zoning district to a lower intensity zoning district, it may be that there'll be height restrictions that apply just in that transition zone between the two. So it's those kinds of rules. And that'll be something that we'll be fleshing out more as we move into the detailed actual drafting of the zoning ordinance.
Thank you. Someone else asked, with respect to the inclusionary zoning, how confident are you that having an affordability limit will simply reduce potential increases in supply and therefore limit the capability of this plan to increase supply? So basically, are the affordability conditions going to be, and I think you've been very careful to say incentives, so they're voluntary, correct? But
No,
are they,
the affordability requirements in the inclusionary zoning ordinance are going to be mandated. So if you're building 10 units or more, you will be required, as we've proposed it, you will be required to provide those affordable units. And I think, the person asking the question is hitting on one of the criticisms of inclusionary zoning, which is that, to understanding that limiting supply has the effect of driving up prices when some of that supply is restricted to just a portion of the population, those earning 60%, households earning 60% of AMI or less, they're not generally available, so they don't contribute to supply as much. Understood. That's I think a legitimate criticism of inclusionary zoning as a tool. But I do think in our market situation and with what the city is trying to accomplish from a policy perspective, particularly as we're seeing that the portion of our population that is increasingly being moving out of the city is at the lowest income ranges. I think our recommendation at the end of the day is that inclusionary zoning policy, it makes sense and needs to be part of our toolkit for the city for meeting our affordable housing goals. Also note, the other real danger with inclusionary zoning is if you ask for more affordable, a deeper level of affordability or more units than the market can really support, or that a typical development project can support, it can have the effect of chilling the overall market, of basically steering development away from basically steering development entirely. And this is documented. I've seen it happen in other places. It can happen. And so that is why our work on this inclusionary zoning wasn't, we didn't start with here's what we're going to do and then just apply it. We started with a really in-depth and detailed analysis of the Charlottesville housing market, understanding what the costs are within this marketplace, what the financing costs are, what the construction costs are, et cetera, and are using that as the basis for the recommendation that shows up in that inclusionary zoning report. And then the other thing that each time I've written an inclusionary zoning ordinance, I've included within that a provision that requires revisiting that ordinance, basically redoing that study on at least a 5-year basis. So that'll also be part of that mix to ensure that, because the market changes, right? It's not going to be consistent over time. And so we're going to need to be able to check back in and make sure that we're still within the parameters of what the market can support. And if the market can support a greater degree of affordability, we want to know that.
And so it seems like what's sort of being described in the inclusionary zoning report is an expectation that to the extent to which inclusionary zoning results in more designated affordable units, it's likely going to be in the higher density areas within town. Is that accurate to say, or is that still kind of a wait and see to some extent?
Well, it is accurate to say as we've been able to put it together to date. And that's because the results of that analysis, that detailed analysis of our housing market to date, have really come away with, based on the incentives that we're offering, that it's going to be most viable in those higher intensity residential areas or the mixed use residential areas, or et cetera, where there's more residential units at play. Now, that being said, inclusionary zoning is often referred to as consisting of a series of dials that you can turn, right? As you turn up the affordability requirement or require a deeper level of affordability, you're increasing the cost of those units. And so you need to turn up the incentives. You need to offer more incentives or more compensating revenue, essentially. So all of that is to say that I think looking at strategies for expanding where we can require affordable units as part of the inclusionary zoning ordinance is something that we're definitely going to continue to be exploring and discussing and talking about both with our team and then also in the conversation that's going to ensue with the draft zoning ordinance. So I fully expect that conversation is not done.
Yeah, and along those lines, some folks have pointed out that the analysis doesn't seem to want to take advantage of some types of incentives, such as waiving certain fees or providing real estate tax relief. Are those things that are still potentially in play as additional mechanisms to either kind of supplement the vision that's already there or maybe expand upon what can be accomplished in terms of what depth of affordability?
Yes, they're definitely still in play. I'll say that the permitting fees didn't really show up as offering much of a value just in the pure kind of financial analysis piece of it. But so that was part of the reason that those were excluded. But it's definitely still on the table. It's something that you know we don't waive fees currently in the city, but we do offer an expedited review, and I'm not sure that necessarily goes away as we move forward. Tax abatement, the only big question for us is whether that actually belongs in the zoning ordinance or whether that becomes something that happens in parallel or we're not sure how necessarily that fits into the conversation just yet. But we were in our report, we attempted to be fully transparent that there are these other options, these are other incentives that were not fully considered in that analysis to date.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
It's 6:30. We have a lot of questions. Could we get 10 more minutes of your time?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much.
You know what, Matthew? I didn't know what our endpoint was, so you could have
Could we get
right
another
by that.
3 hours of your time? And,
Yeah.
Yeah, I like to respect people's time, but I think this is a great opportunity for us all to learn. So the question was asked of basically, how are we going to go from the flume or flum, depending on maybe what region you're from, to the results of the testing, the residential district testing, to a map and the specifics of here you can build this, you can't build that in these circumstances. Could you kind of describe so we can understand what I think is going to be happening this fall?
Right. Yeah. You know, it's going to be. I wish I could say that it was something more than just we're going to be sitting down and talking about the map. We're gonna. You know, I'm personally planning on going through each section of the map, looking at its basis in. I just prefer to say future land use map. It takes longer to say, but you know, I don't know. Then I feel like I know what I'm talking about when I say future land use map as opposed to FLUM. You know, our starting point, the adopted comprehensive plan has within it the future land use map. So that's certainly our starting point, but it is only a starting point. And I'm going to be we've gotten a lot of comments from folks about that map, as well as our intentions relative to the zoning map. You know, I'm going to be taking that forward, and we're going to just have a lot of discussions. I mean, really, that's the only way to do this. We're going to talk about what are the constraints in various places, what are the best practices that arise out of creating a zoning map as opposed to a land use map that we need to take into consideration. One of the things that we have, you know, just started to talk about here recently is how many zoning districts are we talking about? You know, we've been speculating that it would, you know, that the the medium intensity might include multiple zoning districts. There's a lot of conversations there, and really that's how we're going to get to the bottom of this is through those conversations and getting to the point where, we use the feedback that we've gotten to date, we use our own analysis, and we arrive at a draft zoning map. It's not a 1, 2, 3 process. It's going to be a series of discussions. And then again, when we present something in this winter, it's going to be a draft, and we'll take feedback on it again, and we'll hear what people have to say. These things are always an iterative process, and I know for a lot of people there's this frustration with how long it takes to write zoning. This isn't my first time going through a zoning rewrite. It takes a long time because there's a lot of pieces to it. It's just got a huge number of pieces to it, and when you present it piecemeal, it doesn't necessarily make sense. If I present a zoning map by itself without giving people a sense of what are the uses allowed in those districts, what are some of the standards that apply in those districts, it doesn't make sense, and it generates more confusion. So we have to be able to try and present it in chunks of related material, and it takes time to generate those chunks. So it's an iterative process, but they're pieces of time, they're big lengths of time between those pieces as we work through it.
Yeah, and I think that something that I know I personally, as we've gone through this process, I find I'm a speech language pathologist, not an expert on anything related to this, but the city has not done something like this in a very long time, and so we're kind of all learning together. And the NDS plus the consultants are kind of creating these types of documents that we've never seen before. And I think the idea that you've continually mentioned is that this is going to be, we're going to get this out there, we're going to get it for review, but then we're going to kind of be over time revising things. Already the comp plan is probably going to get changed as we approve the zoning ordinance, and this is we've become, it's a nice way to say this. We're stuck in the past. We're running off an old zoning document, and we're going into something new. But I think the idea of this being kind of a living thing that evolves over time is a new way for us to think about things. And that's kind of scary in some ways, but also exciting. So thank you for that explanation.
And just on that note, I know we've got other questions to get to, but one of the things I say all the time when I'm working on a zoning project is this is not going to be Charlottesville's final zoning ordinance, right? To the point that we were just saying, there will be continual adoptions. And so I'll leave it at that. Let's move on with the questions. Yeah.
So question about how the zoning relates to the sensitive community designation or general residential sensitive from the future land use map, and how these are going to tie into the toolkit to avoid displacement in at-risk communities. Could you kind of expand on the intersection of those things?
I can't very much at this point because we are still working on that issue. I think one of the challenges we're facing, I'm developing a list of the various things that are high priority issues that are not just zoning, right? Zoning, zoning is a big tool. It covers a lot of ground, but it can't do everything. And one of the things that it can't do by itself is fully address the issue of displacement. So we are thinking about ways that we can set the zoning ordinance up to support reducing the potential for displacement, but it can't act alone. And so that is an ongoing conversation, and we'll keep at it.
My family is eager for this to be over, but we're going to do a few more questions. So multiple questions around one of my favorite topics, parking. And I think a couple questions kind of asking for some clarification on reducing parking minimums or parking requirements as part of making inclusionary zoning work. So if you could expand on that, and then maybe expand on how Charlottesville, with its environmental and climate goals, can use zoning to help achieve those goals, particularly with respect to the area of parking?
Sure. So first, it's really important to understand that parking is a major cost for for really any development project. People often underestimate the level of cost, the expense of producing parking. And that expense is not just in the physical laying of asphalt and doing all of the drainage and associated infrastructure work that's necessary to plaster a piece of land with asphalt. It's also in the cost of that land is now being used for parking and can't be used for a productive use like housing, a rent producing use like a commercial use or housing, what have you. So parking is incredibly expensive. And so the flip side is when you reduce the required amount of parking, it can have a significant benefit towards the bottom line of a project that's attempting to produce affordable units. Now, that's also a very good example of one of those incentives that we're offering as an incentive, but again, you still have to do the affordable housing even if you don't make use of the incentive. Which, it's important to say that because while we're proposing to reduce the minimum parking requirement, the minimum number of parking spaces someone has to provide, many developers are still going to choose to provide that parking, right? Because parking is a significant amenity. I mean, we're talking about an amenity for a development project. It's probably for many people choosing a place to rent, it's probably a more important amenity than the fitness room. So many developers are still going to choose to install that parking. But when we don't mandate it, we create the flexibility for a developer to make the decision that works best for the financing of their project, the location of their project, et cetera. And when you factor in the climate change objectives, how can we reduce the degree to which we're reliant on private automobiles? We know, if I can use a different but related example, we're talking about requiring a minimum amount of bicycle parking spaces. Why do we require a minimum number of bicycle parking spaces? Because that reduces the obstacles to bicycle ownership and therefore encourages people to use bicycles. Why were many people in the auto industry way back 100 years ago interested in seeing minimum vehicle parking spaces in zoning ordinances all across the country? Because it reduces the obstacles to car ownership and thereby encourages people to make use of cars over other modes of transportation, right? That is the effect that minimum parking requirement has, and to the extent as a public policy goal that we don't want to have that effect, we should be reducing or eliminating our minimum parking requirement. But that doesn't absolve us of the need to manage parking as an issue, and so that remains a very important part of how the city might choose to move forward. Is then thinking about how do we address parking needs, and parking issues on our streets.
All right, I think we're going to stop there. My children are ready to spend some time with me, not with their mother. But thank you so much, James. I really appreciate the work that you and so many others, both within the city, the consultants, but also so many community members, the way that people are engaging. People are really excited about that. So really appreciate your time today and the work you've been doing. And I just want to mention a couple things with Livable Cville. We are going to be putting out some talking points over the next few days prior to the September 6th deadline for people that would like to chime in, but would maybe like some guidance. Those will be going up on our Facebook and Twitter. And additionally, there is a special use permit for JPA coming up soon, 2005 JPA, which is a in our view, a great opportunity to help students live where they want to live and not create displacement in neighborhoods like Fifeville and 10th and Page, while also the city will get some money towards affordable housing out of it if it's approved by council. On October 16th, we're going to have an e-bike demo day at Mead Park from 2 to 4 p.m. If you are interested in e-bikes, our family has 2. We love them. They're super fun. Everyone will be invited to come and join that. We'll have a big variety of e-bikes for people to try out. And if you are interested in getting a little more involved in housing, land use, and transportation advocacy in Charlottesville, whether it's just to send a few emails or to speak at meetings or to do research or come up with new ideas to focus on, you can email us at livablecville@gmail.com, Livable Cville@gmail.com. Thank you all so much and have a nice rest of your evening.